Hey guys, tonight we're starting with a journey into one of the strangest corners of ancient history. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe pull up a blanket, and let the noise of the modern world slowly drift away. Tonight, we're traveling back nearly 2,000 years to ancient Rome, where marble temples gleamed in the Mediterranean sun, armies marched across continents, and one emperor became so infamous that people are still talking about him today. And not necessarily for the reasons he would have preferred. Because tonight's story is about the Roman emperor known as Caligula. Now, if you've heard anything about Caligula before, there's a good chance it involves some combination of madness, cruelty, scandal, and a horse. Especially the horse. In fact, Caligula became so notorious that one of the most famous stories about him claims that he planned to make his beloved horse a senator. Some versions go even further. Some claim he intended to make the horse a consul, one of the highest offices in the entire Roman Empire. Because apparently governing one of the largest empires on earth was difficult enough without introducing livestock into politics. Although, depending on your opinion of politicians, perhaps some Romans saw little difference. But before we get to the horse, we need to understand the world that produced Caligula. Because people are rarely born as monsters. And even when history remembers someone as a villain, the real story is usually much more complicated. The Roman Empire of Caligula's childhood was a place of incredible wealth and incredible fear. On the surface, Rome appeared stronger than ever. Its armies controlled vast territories stretching across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Merchants carried silk, spices, wine, and precious metals along busy trade routes. Massive public buildings rose from the city center. Crowds filled theaters and arenas. Everything seemed stable. But beneath that stability lurked anxiety. Because Rome had only recently transformed from a republic into an empire. For centuries Romans had proudly governed themselves through elected officials and powerful aristocratic families. At least that was the official version. The reality had always been somewhat messy. Powerful men fought each other constantly. Civil wars erupted. Political rivals mysteriously disappeared. The usual activities of ambitious politicians. Eventually one man emerged victorious. His name was Augustus. Augustus became Rome's first emperor. He was clever enough to avoid calling himself a king. Romans hated kings. They had spent centuries congratulating themselves for getting rid of them. So Augustus carefully maintained the appearance of republican government while quietly holding ultimate power. It was a brilliant solution. At least until future emperors inherited that power. Because not every ruler possessed Augustus's patience, intelligence, or restraint. Some possessed very little restraint at all. Into this complicated world, a boy named Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus was born in the year 12 CE. History remembers him by a different name. Caligula. Ironically, it wasn't even a proper name. It started as a childhood nickname. His father was the celebrated General Germanicus, one of Rome's greatest military heroes. When little Gaius accompanied his father's troops, soldiers delighted in dressing him in miniature military clothing. Tiny armor. Tiny tunic. Tiny boots. The boots were called caligi. And because soldiers have apparently enjoyed creating embarrassing nicknames for children throughout human history, they began calling him Caligula. Little Boots. Imagine growing up to become Emperor of Rome and still being remembered by a nickname that essentially means tiny shoes. History can be surprisingly cruel. Yet Caligula's early years appeared remarkably promising. His father Germanicus was adored throughout the empire. He was handsome, successful, charismatic. Everything Romans wanted in a leader. Many believed Germanicus would eventually become emperor. And when people looked at young Caligula, they saw the son of Rome's golden hero. A child seemingly destined for greatness. Unfortunately, destiny had other plans. In the year 19 CE, Germanicus died suddenly under mysterious circumstances. He was only 33 years old. Rumors spread immediately. Some claimed poisoning. Others suspected political conspiracy. Many blamed powerful enemies within the imperial government. Whether those accusations were true remains uncertain. What is certain is that Germanicus's death devastated his family. Caligula was still a child. And suddenly the secure world he knew began collapsing. His mother Agrippina became convinced that enemies had murdered her husband. She launched fierce political attacks against those she considered responsible. This proved dangerous, because the emperor at the time was Tiberius. And Tiberius was not a man who enjoyed criticism, or opposition, or really any form of disagreement whatsoever. As tensions escalated, Agrippina and several family members fell from favor. Exile followed. Then imprisonment. Some relatives died under suspicious circumstances. Others simply vanished from public life. Young Caligula watched as powerful members of his family were destroyed one by one. Imagine growing up in an environment where every conversation might be overheard. Every friendship might be a trap. Every mistake could prove fatal. It was not exactly an ideal childhood. Still, Caligula survived. And survival in the Roman imperial family was an achievement in itself. Eventually he was brought into the household of Emperor Tiberius. At first glance this might sound fortunate. Living with the emperor offered prestige, protection, and opportunity. But Tiberius had become increasingly isolated and suspicious. He spent much of his later reign on the island of Capri, far from Rome. Ancient historians describe a court filled with fear, intrigue, and constant political maneuvering. Whether every story is accurate remains debated. Roman historians love dramatic tales almost as much as modern social media. Yet even allowing for exaggeration, Capri was hardly a cheerful place. Caligula learned valuable lessons there. He learned how dangerous power could be. He learned how quickly fortunes changed. Most importantly, he learned how to hide his true feelings. One ancient writer later claimed that Caligula possessed no better servant and no worse master than himself. It was a memorable phrase, and perhaps an insightful one, because for years Caligula successfully concealed whatever thoughts and ambitions lay beneath the surface. He smiled. He obeyed. He survived. In a court where many others perished. And as the years passed, something remarkable happened. The frightened boy gradually became the leading candidate to inherit the empire. By the time Tiberius grew old and frail, Caligula stood near the center of Roman politics. The son of beloved Germanicus. The survivor of countless intrigues. The young man many Romans hoped would restore glory and optimism to imperial rule. They could not know what would happen next. Neither could Caligula. But the stage was set. The empire waited. The old emperor weakened. And somewhere in the future stood a horse that would become one of history's most famous animals. A horse that, according to legend, would nearly become a politician. Which, as we'll discover, says almost as much about Rome as it does about Caligula. But that story must wait for a little while longer. Because first, Caligula had to become emperor. The death of Emperor Tiberius arrived in the year 37 CE. For most Romans, the news felt less like the passing of a beloved ruler and more like the lifting of a very large, very heavy curtain. Tiberius had ruled for more than 20 years. He had inherited an empire that was stable and prosperous. Yet over time his reign had become associated with fear, political trials, accusations of treason, and endless rumors. By the end, many Romans simply wanted something different. Anything different. And standing at the center of that hope was Caligula, the son of Germanicus, the surviving member of a family that people still admired, the handsome young prince who seemed capable of bringing a fresh start. When news spread that Caligula would become emperor, celebrations erupted across Rome. Crowds filled the streets. People offered sacrifices. Public excitement reached levels rarely seen in Roman politics. Ancient writers claim that many citizens practically treated the event as a holiday. And honestly, after years of living under Tiberius, they probably felt they had earned one. For the first time in a long while, optimism returned. The empire believed it had found its golden prince. A young ruler who would heal old wounds. A ruler who would restore trust. A ruler who would absolutely not become one of the most notorious emperors in history. History, unfortunately, enjoys surprises. At first, however, everything seemed wonderful. Caligula entered Rome to enormous public enthusiasm. He honored his deceased parents. He paid tribute to Germanicus. He treated the memory of his family with respect. The people loved it. The Senate loved it. The army loved it. Even historians who later despised Caligula generally admitted that his first months as emperor appeared promising. He abolished some unpopular taxes. He released prisoners. He recalled political exiles. He organized public games and celebrations. Everywhere he went, crowds cheered. If approval ratings had existed in ancient Rome, Caligula would have been enjoying the political equivalent of a perfect score. The young emperor seemed determined to show that a new era had arrived. And perhaps, for a brief moment, he genuinely intended to be a good ruler. That possibility is easy to forget because of everything that came later. But human beings rarely begin their stories at the ending. The tragedy of Caligula is not simply that he became infamous. The tragedy is that there was once genuine hope surrounding him. Hope that slowly curdled into something darker. For several months Rome basked in celebration. The city enjoyed festivals. Citizens praised the emperor. Poets composed flattering verses. The Senate enthusiastically approved honors. Everyone appeared eager to stay on the good side of the popular new ruler. A strategy that would eventually become less voluntary. Then disaster struck. Only a few months after taking power, Caligula fell seriously ill. Ancient sources describe an illness so severe that many believed he would die. The entire empire held its breath. People prayed for his recovery. Temples filled with anxious worshippers. Roman citizens who had only recently celebrated his rise now feared losing him. Eventually Caligula recovered. And according to many ancient historians, he was never quite the same afterward. Now, historians today debate this idea. Some scholars argue that ancient writers exaggerated the transformation. Others suggest the illness may have affected him physically or mentally. The truth is difficult to determine. Ancient medical records were not exactly detailed. Roman physicians rarely wrote things like, "Patient displays symptoms consistent with neurological complications. Recommend follow-up appointment in 6 weeks." Instead, they often blamed gods, bad air, or unfortunate planetary arrangements. Not particularly helpful for modern diagnosis. Whatever happened, many observers believed a noticeable change occurred after Caligula recovered. The cheerful young emperor gradually became more unpredictable, more suspicious, more extravagant, more interested in displaying his absolute power. Perhaps years of fear and suppressed emotion finally emerged. Perhaps the immense pressure of ruling an empire affected him. Or perhaps unlimited power simply revealed aspects of his personality that had always existed beneath the surface. History cannot provide a definitive answer, but it can show us the results. One of the first signs appeared in Caligula's relationship with the Senate. Now the Senate liked to imagine itself as an important governing body. Technically it still possessed influence. Technically it still represented Rome's aristocratic elite. Technically it mattered. At least that was the theory. The reality was more complicated. Emperors held ultimate authority. Everyone knew it. The Senate knew it. The emperor knew it. Even the pigeons perched on Roman rooftops probably knew it. Yet maintaining the illusion remained politically useful. Most emperors treated senators with at least a minimum level of respect. Caligula increasingly did not. He mocked them, humiliated them, forced them into embarrassing situations. One famous story claims that he made senators run alongside his chariot during long journeys. Imagine being one of the most powerful aristocrats in the empire. Owner of vast estates. Descendant of ancient noble families. And suddenly your job description includes jogging beside the emperor's vehicle because he thinks it's amusing. Roman dignity suffered a difficult period during Caligula's reign. The emperor seemed fascinated by demonstrating that nobody could challenge him. Nobody. Not generals. Not senators. Not wealthy aristocrats. Not even the traditions of Rome itself. At times he appeared almost theatrical, as though government had become a stage performance and he was determined to occupy every role. Yet while senators grew increasingly uncomfortable, ordinary citizens often continued supporting him. After all, public spectacles remained lavish. Games became grander. Entertainment became more extravagant. Caligula spent enormous sums organizing events. The people received excitement. The emperor received admiration. At least temporarily. Because there was one small problem. Actually, several billion small problems. Money. Running an empire costs a great deal. Running an empire while funding endless spectacles costs even more. Caligula inherited significant wealth from Tiberius. Yet he spent it at astonishing speed. Ancient writers describe fortunes disappearing into public projects, celebrations, gifts, and personal extravagance. Whether every figure they provide is accurate remains uncertain. Ancient historians occasionally treated numbers with creative enthusiasm. Still, there is little doubt that spending increased dramatically. The imperial treasury began shrinking. And when money grows scarce, rulers often become inventive. Unfortunately, inventive governments have historically caused concern among taxpayers. New methods of raising revenue appeared. Confiscations increased. Fines multiplied. Wealthy individuals suddenly discovered that attracting imperial attention was not always beneficial. Some found themselves accused of crimes. Others lost property. A few probably wished the emperor would develop a less expensive hobby. Meanwhile, Caligula's behavior continued attracting attention. Stories multiplied. Some portrayed him as eccentric. Others portrayed him as dangerous. Many likely mixed fact with exaggeration. The challenge for historians is separating reality from rumor. Ancient Roman writers often hated certain emperors. When they disliked someone, their descriptions could become wonderfully dramatic. Imagine every political opponent writing your biography. The results might not be entirely balanced. Yet even accounting for exaggeration, Caligula's reign clearly grew stranger. He began embracing increasingly elaborate displays of personal power. He enjoyed being worshipped. He enjoyed public admiration. He enjoyed reminding everyone that he stood above ordinary citizens, and perhaps above ordinary rules. Some accounts claim he appeared dressed as various gods. Others suggest he encouraged divine honors. To Romans, this created mixed reactions. Some people accepted it. Others found it unsettling. Rome traditionally deified emperors after death. Doing it while still alive felt somewhat premature. Like attending your own retirement party at age 25. The message was clear. Caligula believed he occupied a unique position in the universe. A position ordinary mortals should acknowledge. Preferably often. And preferably while praising him. Meanwhile, whispers circulated through the corridors of power. Was the emperor unstable? Was he dangerous? Had illness altered him? Or were frightened aristocrats simply reacting to a ruler who enjoyed humiliating them? No one knew for certain. What everyone knew was that the atmosphere in Rome was changing. The cheerful optimism of his first months had begun fading. Fear slowly returned. Not the same fear people associated with Tiberius. A different kind. More unpredictable. More personal. Like living beside a thunderstorm that could arrive without warning. And yet Caligula remained young. Very young. He was still in his 20s. An emperor with virtually unlimited power, surrounded by wealth, flattery, and constant attention. History contains many examples suggesting that such conditions rarely improve a person's judgment. In fact, they often produce precisely the opposite effect. The coming years would demonstrate that lesson with remarkable clarity. And somewhere within the imperial stables stood a horse named Incitatus. At the moment, he was simply a horse. A very well-treated horse, certainly. But still a horse. He could not possibly know that future generations would remember his name. That historians would discuss him. That storytellers would repeat tales about him. Or that his owner was gradually becoming one of the most infamous rulers Rome had ever seen. For now, Incitatus enjoyed an enviable life. Comfortable stables. Excellent food. Attentive servants. A lifestyle many Roman citizens would probably have accepted without hesitation. But the horse's greatest fame still lay ahead. Because Caligula's affection for Incitatus was about to become legendary. And the line between political satire, imperial arrogance, and outright madness would soon become very difficult to see. By the time Caligula's reign entered its later years, Rome had become accustomed to surprises. Not pleasant surprises. not the kind involving unexpected gifts or fortunate discoveries. More the kind that made senators wake up in the morning wondering whether today would be ordinary or whether the emperor had invented a completely new method of embarrassing them. The answer increasingly seemed to be the second option. And it was during this strange period that one particular horse began trotting into history. His name was Incitatus. Now, before we continue, it is important to remember something. Incitatus himself was completely innocent. History has many villains, many tyrants, many scheming politicians. Incitatus was not one of them. He was simply a horse. A horse who happened to belong to the most talked about ruler in the Roman world. Yet somehow, through a combination of imperial attention and centuries of storytelling, Incitatus achieved a level of historical fame that countless Roman generals never managed to reach. There are probably ancient governors who spent 30 years managing provinces who would be deeply annoyed by this. The horse, according to ancient sources, received extraordinary treatment. Not good treatment. Not excellent treatment. Extraordinary treatment. Writers claim that Incitatus lived in a marble stable. His stall supposedly featured ivory decorations. He enjoyed fine blankets. He received carefully prepared food. Servants attended to his needs. Guests reportedly received invitations to dinners held in his honor. And if that sounds ridiculous, remember that many Romans thought exactly the same thing. The stories spread quickly. Some people laughed. Others worried. A few probably wondered whether they had somehow entered a dream. Because while wealthy Romans often loved their horses, Caligula appeared determined to elevate this particular animal into something approaching celebrity status. At least according to the stories that survive. Now historians have spent centuries debating exactly how much of this is true. Ancient authors such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio recorded these tales, but they wrote after Caligula's death and often relied on second-hand information. Furthermore, both authors clearly disliked Caligula. And when historians dislike their subject, unusual stories have a tendency to multiply. That doesn't mean the stories are false. It simply means we should approach them carefully. Ancient gossip traveled surprisingly well, especially when the target was unpopular. Still, even cautious historians generally agree that Caligula genuinely adored Incitatus. The horse appears to have been one of his favorite possessions. Perhaps even one of his favorite companions. Which may sound odd. But when you consider Caligula's circumstances, it becomes slightly more understandable. Human relationships had rarely brought him comfort. His father died when he was young. His mother suffered exile. Many relatives disappeared, were imprisoned, or died under political pressure. Friends could become enemies overnight. Allies could betray one another. Trust was dangerous. A horse, on the other hand, never plotted. Never lied. Never joined conspiracies. Never criticized imperial decisions. For a ruler surrounded by suspicion, that might have seemed refreshing. Incitatus, unlike many humans in Rome, wanted nothing from Caligula except food and care. And honestly, that probably made him one of the emperor's most reliable associates. Yet affection alone does not explain why the horse became legendary. That legend centers on one remarkable claim. The claim that Caligula planned to appoint Incitatus as a senator. Or perhaps even consul. One of the highest offices in Roman government. At first glance, the story sounds completely absurd. A horse cannot debate legislation. A horse cannot administer provinces. A horse cannot manage diplomatic negotiations. Although some frustrated Roman senators may have argued that these qualifications were not always strictly necessary, the image remains unforgettable. Rows of distinguished Roman aristocrats seated in their white togas. Political debates echoing through the chamber. And among them, one exceptionally well-groomed horse. It is exactly the sort of story people remember, which explains why it survived for nearly 2,000 years. But did it actually happen? The answer is surprisingly complicated. Most historians today believe that Incitatus never officially became a senator. No evidence suggests the appointment occurred. Instead, many scholars think Caligula may have been making a point. Or rather, several points. None particularly flattering toward the Senate. Remember, by this stage of his reign, Caligula openly despised many senators. He mocked them repeatedly. He enjoyed demonstrating their powerlessness. He seemed almost obsessed with exposing how little authority they truly possessed. Against that background, the horse story takes on a different meaning. Imagine Caligula standing before Rome's aristocracy and suggesting that his horse could perform their duties. The insult would have been devastating. Not because people believed the horse was qualified, but because the emperor was essentially saying, "My horse is as useful as you are." It was mockery elevated to imperial scale. A joke with enormous political consequences. The senators certainly would not have appreciated it, although they would have been wise enough not to say so aloud. The possibility that the horse story began as satire is attractive because it fits Caligula's personality. He loved humiliation. He loved shocking people. He loved reminding powerful individuals that their status depended entirely on his favor. What better way to accomplish that than by comparing Rome's elite to a horse? Yet there may have been something darker beneath the humor. Because jokes often reveal genuine contempt. And Caligula's contempt for the Senate had become increasingly obvious. The relationship between emperor and aristocracy was deteriorating rapidly. Mutual distrust poisoned everything. Senators feared Caligula. Caligula despised senators. Neither side expected reconciliation. Each new insult deepened hostility. Each new humiliation created fresh resentment. And resentment has a way of accumulating. Like storm clouds gathering over the sea. At first the sky merely darkens. Then the wind changes. Then suddenly everyone realizes a storm has arrived. The horse story represented one of those darkening clouds. Even if it never became reality. Even if it remained only a threat. The symbolism mattered. Because Rome's ruling class understood exactly what the emperor was saying. They were not indispensable. They were not respected. And they were certainly not safe. Meanwhile, Caligula continued pursuing increasingly extravagant projects. One of the most famous involved a floating bridge. According to ancient accounts, he ordered a temporary bridge constructed across part of the Bay of Baiae. Ships were lined up side by side. Platforms were built atop them. The result stretched for miles across the water. Once completed, Caligula rode across the bridge wearing the armor of a conqueror. It was a spectacular display. Expensive. Impractical. Dramatic. Very much in keeping with his style. Some observers admired the achievement. Others viewed it as another sign of excess. Either way, nobody ignored it. that was one thing Caligula understood extremely well. Attention. He knew how to command it. He knew how to dominate conversations. He knew how to make himself the center of every room, every ceremony, every rumor. The horse story functioned similarly. Whether true, exaggerated, or misunderstood, people discussed it constantly. And perhaps that was part of the point. Powerful rulers throughout history have often recognized that being talked about can become a form of power itself. People fear what they cannot predict. And Caligula was becoming increasingly unpredictable. Some days he appeared generous. Other days he appeared cruel. Some decisions seemed rational. Others seemed baffling. Friends could become enemies without warning. Fortunes changed overnight. The atmosphere of uncertainty grew heavier. Roman society began adapting to life under an emperor whose moods mattered enormously. Courtiers learned caution. Officials chose words carefully. Even casual conversations carried risks. No one wanted to attract unwanted attention. Because under Caligula, attention could become dangerous. And yet, despite everything, his reign remained surprisingly short. Sometimes when people hear stories about Caligula, they imagine decades of madness and excess. In reality, he ruled for less than 4 years. Less than 4 years. That brief period generated enough stories to fill entire libraries. Imagine how exhausting those years must have felt to the people living through them. Every month seemed to produce another scandal. Another controversy. Another shocking tale. The horse was merely one chapter. An unforgettable chapter. But only one chapter. Because while Rome laughed, gossiped, and worried about Incitatus, something far more serious was developing behind the scenes. The emperor's enemies were multiplying. Quietly. Patiently. Dangerously. Men who felt humiliated. Men who felt threatened. Men who feared for their futures. Some belonged to the Senate. Others belonged to the military. Still others served within Caligula's own household. And unlike Incitatus, these individuals possessed ambitions, grudges, and weapons. The emperor may have believed himself untouchable. Many rulers eventually do. Power has a remarkable ability to create confidence. Sometimes justified confidence. Sometimes fatal confidence. Caligula's confidence was approaching a very dangerous level. Because while he mocked senators and celebrated horses, conspirators were beginning to ask a question that had shaped Roman politics for generations. A simple question. A deadly question. What happens if the emperor dies? And before long, someone would decide to find out. As the 4th year of Caligula's reign approached, Rome no longer felt like the hopeful city that had celebrated his arrival. The cheers had faded. The optimism had faded. Even the excitement had begun to fade. What remained was uncertainty. And uncertainty can be exhausting, especially when it lasts for years. People never quite knew which version of the emperor they might encounter. The generous ruler who sponsored games and public celebrations. Or the unpredictable ruler who delighted in humiliating powerful men. The line between entertainment and intimidation had become increasingly blurred. And nowhere was that uncertainty felt more strongly than inside the imperial palace itself. Because if ordinary Romans felt uneasy, the people closest to Caligula often felt terrified. Imagine working for a man whose moods could shift without warning. A man who possessed absolute power. a man whose favor could make your career, or whose displeasure could end your life. Every conversation became a careful performance. Every expression required consideration. Every word carried risk. The palace had become a place where survival depended upon reading the emperor's mood. And moods, unfortunately, are not always easy to predict, particularly when the person experiencing them controls an empire. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing month. Whispers traveled through corridors. Servants exchanged rumors in private. Officials watched one another carefully. Nobody fully trusted anybody else, which, ironically, was becoming one of the defining features of Caligula's Rome. Trust had become a scarce resource. Fear was far more abundant. The emperor himself appeared increasingly isolated. This often happens to rulers who accumulate enormous power. At first they enjoy endless companionship. People flatter them, praise them, agree with them, laugh at their jokes. Even the bad jokes. Especially the bad jokes. But over time something changes. The ruler begins wondering who is sincere, who genuinely cares, who secretly hates them, who might betray them. And because powerful rulers can rarely be certain, suspicion begins filling the empty spaces. The result is isolation. Not physical isolation. Emotional isolation. A loneliness hidden beneath crowds and ceremonies. Caligula may have been surrounded by thousands of people, yet he seems to have trusted very few. Perhaps none at all. And when a ruler trusts nobody, nobody trusts the ruler. The cycle feeds itself. Fear creates suspicion. Suspicion creates fear. Round and round it goes, until eventually someone decides the cycle must end. By this point, many influential Romans had reasons to resent Caligula. Some felt insulted. Others felt threatened. Others simply feared becoming future targets. His treatment of the Senate had created countless enemies. His financial policies angered wealthy citizens. His unpredictable behavior frightened military officers. His constant displays of superiority irritated almost everyone who valued personal dignity. And Roman aristocrats valued dignity almost as much as they valued wealth. Perhaps more. After all, many wealthy people throughout history have tolerated losing money. Being publicly humiliated is often much harder to forgive, especially for proud men accustomed to respect. Slowly, quietly, conspiracies began forming. Not large conspiracies at first. Small conversations. Private complaints. Carefully worded discussions. The sort of conversations people have when they are uncertain whom they can trust. At first, most participants probably had no intention of assassination. People rarely begin political discussions by immediately proposing murder. Usually there is a gradual progression. First frustration, then resentment, then fear, then the dangerous realization that the current situation might never improve. That realization changes everything. Because once people stop hoping for change, they begin considering alternatives. And in ancient Rome, alternatives often involved sharp objects. One of the most important figures in the emerging conspiracy was a military officer named Cassius Chaerea. At first glance, Chaerea seemed an unlikely threat. He served within the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own elite bodyguards. His job was literally to protect Caligula. which would eventually become awkward. Very awkward. Ancient historians suggest that Caligula frequently mocked Cheria. Apparently the officer possessed a somewhat soft voice. Or perhaps a mannerism the emperor found amusing. Whatever the reason, Caligula reportedly enjoyed humiliating him. Again. And again. And again. Now, occasional teasing might not seem significant. But constant public humiliation has consequences. Especially when directed at proud military officers. Eventually resentment hardens. And hardened resentment can become dangerous. Particularly when combined with starting with a journey into one of the strangest corners of ancient history. Meanwhile the emperor continued behaving as though his position remained secure. Pull up a blanket, and let the noise of the modern world slowly drift away. Many rulers make this mistake. We're traveling back nearly 2,000 years to ancient Rome, where marble temples gleamed in the Mediterranean sun. Loyalty. Armies marched across the people who fear you today, and one emperor became so infamous that people are still talking about him suppresses problems, and not necessarily for the reasons he would have preferred. And beneath the surface of Roman tonight's story is about the Roman emperor known as Caligula. By early 41 about Caligula, the situation had become critical. There's a good chance it involved some combination of madness, expanded their plans, scandal, and a horse. More individuals became involved, especially the horse. The risks increased. In fact, Caligula became so notorious that one of the most famous stories about him was no simple man to make his beloved horse a failure meant death. Some versions go even further. Some claim for their families as well. Horse a consul, one of the highest offices in the entire Roman Empire. Yet many participants concluded that continuing under one of the largest empires on Earth was difficult enough without introducing tells us a great deal about conditions in Rome. Although, depending on your opinion of politicians, unless they believe the alternatives are a little difference. Eventually, before we get to the horse, we need to understand the world that produced Caligula. Brutal, because people are rarely born as monsters. Would be killed. And even when history remembers someone as a villain, the real story is usually much more complicated. Just a sudden strike. The Roman Empire of Caligula's childhood was a place of incredible wealth and incredible fear. At least that was the theory. Rome appeared stronger than reality tends to be messy. Its armies controlled the chosen territory stretching across January of North Africa CE in the Middle East. Caligula attended a series of public games and performances, wine, and precious metals along busy trade routes. Crowds of public buildings rose from the city's attended ceremonies. Crowds filled theaters and arenas. Everything seemed on the surface. But beneath that stability lurked anxiety. Prepared themselves, because Rome had only recently transformed from a republic into an empire. For centuries Romans had proudly governed themselves through elected officials and powerful aristocratic families. Of their motives, they were about to change the official version forever. The reality had always been somewhat messy. On the day itself, powerful men fought each other through a covered passageway connected to the palace complex. Political rivals mysteriously disappeared. A routine movement, the usual activities of ordinary moment that rarely attracts attention. Eventually one man emerged victorious. His name was Augustus. Augustus became Rome's first emperor. The officer of the emperor to avoid calling himself a king. The officer entrusted with imperial protection. They had spent centuries congratulating themselves for getting rid of them. Historians often disagree when maintain the appearance of a public government while quietly holding remember different things. It was a brilliant solution. At least until future emperors inherited that broad outline remains clear. Because not every ruler possessed Augustus's patience, intelligence, or restraint. The emperor realized danger too little restraint at all. Chaos erupted into this complicated world. Shouts echoed through the corridor. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus was born in the year 12 Within moments, Caligula lay mortally remembers him by a different name. He was 28 years old. Caligula. Ironically, it wasn't even one of the most infamous rulers in Roman history. It started as a childhood less than 4 years. His father was the celebrated General Germanicus, surrounded by men who no longer feared him enough to obey. When little Gaius accompanied his father of how quickly soldiers delighted in dressing him in miniature military clothing. Emperor commands millions. Tiny armor. The next moment everything is over. Tiny titles vanish. The boots were called vanishes. And because soldiers have apparently enjoyed creating embarrassing nicknames for children, the violence did not end with Caligula. They began calling him Caligula. Unfortunately, Roman politics rarely stopped after growing up to become Emperor of Rome and still being remembered by a nickname that essentially means tiny spread throughout the palace. History can be surprisingly cruel. The imperial family became targets. Yet Caligula's early years appeared remarkably promising. His father Germanicus was adored throughout the empire. No one knew he was handsome. For several tense hours, Rome hovered between order and chaos. Everything Romans wanted in a leader. City. Many believed Germanicus would eventually become emperor. Others panicked. And when people looked at young Caligula, they saw the son of Rome's the most common response during political crises. Seemingly destined for greatness. People want to know who has won before choosing sides. Destiny had other plans. A sensible strategy. In the year 19 generally speaking, Germanicus died suddenly under mysterious circumstances. Some senators dreamed of restoring the old republic. Rumors spread immediately. No emperor. No dynasty. Poisoning. No single ruler dominating Roman politics. Just the Senate governing enemies within the imperial government. At least in theory, whether those accusations were true remains uncertain. What is certain is that Germanicus's death devastated his family. Too much had changed. Caligula was still a child, had grown too large, and suddenly the military had become too powerful. His mother Agrippina no became convinced that enemies had murdered her husband. Events soon proved she launched fierce political attacks against those she considered possibilities. Soldiers made decisions dangerous, and soldiers often carried more influence than philosophers. And Tiberius was not a man who enjoyed criticism or dreamers or opposition. Inside the palace, or really any form of disagreement whatsoever, a man named Claudius. As tensions escalated, the uncle of Caligula and several family members for years many Romans had underestimated exile followed. Some viewed him as imprisonment. Others viewed him as died under suspicious circumstances. Few viewed him as a future emperor. Others simply vanished from public life. These moments. Young Caligula watched as powerful members of his family were destroyed one by one. The man nobody expected. Growing up in an environment where according to conversation Claudius was discovered hiding behind every friendship might be a trap. A Praetorian guardsman every mistake could prove fatal. Recognized him. It was not exactly an ideal childhood. Saluted him. Still, Caligula survived. They proclaimed Claudius emperor. Just like that. The empire had a new ruler. No elections. No lengthy debates. No constitutional process. Just soldiers deciding who would wear the crown. Or rather, the invisible Roman equivalent of a crown. And so the dynasty survived. The republic remained dead. The Senate remained frustrated. And Claudius unexpectedly found himself ruling the Roman world. As for Caligula, his story had ended. But his legend was only beginning. Because after his death, stories multiplied. Rumors expanded. Scandals grew. Every shocking tale became larger. Every strange incident became stranger. The horse story survived. The bridge survived. The extravagance survived. His reputation transformed into something almost mythical. A symbol of imperial madness. A warning about absolute power. A cautionary tale repeated for centuries. Whether every story was true mattered less than what people believed. And people believed many things about Caligula. Some true. Some exaggerated. Some almost certainly invented. Yet all of them reflected a deeper fear. the fear of what happens when unlimited power rests in human hands. Because even today, nearly 2,000 years later, people still remember the emperor who supposedly wanted his horse to become a senator. Not because of the horse itself, but because the story captures something timeless. The absurdity of power, the fragility of authority, and the strange reality that sometimes the most powerful man in the world can become remembered for a horse. Poor Incitatus probably never understood any of it. He simply enjoyed his comfortable stable, his meals, his quiet life, which, when compared to the fate of many Roman politicians, may have been the wiser arrangement. And with that, our strange journey through the life and legend of Caligula comes to an end. The emperor is gone. The conspirators are gone. The senators are gone. Even the empire itself is gone. But the stories remain. Quiet echoes from a distant world. Stories of ambition, fear, loneliness, power, and one remarkably famous horse. A horse who, for a brief moment in history, came closer to political office than anyone could have imagined. And perhaps that is the most Roman ending of a Was Caligula Really Mad? Now, if this were the end of the story, Caligula would simply be remembered as an unpopular emperor who met a violent end. Ancient Rome had plenty of those. In fact, if Roman emperors had a club, died violently after upsetting important people would have been one of the membership requirements. But Caligula occupies a different place in history. His name became something larger than a biography. It became a symbol. Even today, when people hear the name Caligula, they immediately think of madness. Not ordinary bad decisions. Not ordinary arrogance. Madness. The image is familiar. A ruler so unstable that he wanted his horse to become a senator. A ruler so detached from reality that he believed himself a living god. A ruler so cruel and unpredictable that everyone around him lived in constant fear. But here is where things become interesting. And perhaps a little complicated. Because historians have spent centuries asking a very simple question. Was Caligula actually insane? Or did history create a monster that never truly existed? The answer, unfortunately, is buried beneath nearly 2,000 years of rumor, politics, exaggeration, and storytelling. Which means we need to approach the subject carefully. The first thing to remember is that almost everything we know about Caligula comes from writers who lived after his death. That is important. Very important. Most of our information comes from historians who never met him personally. They relied on earlier sources, official records, rumors, and stories that circulated throughout Roman society. Some of those stories were undoubtedly true. Others may have grown larger with each retelling. Human beings have always enjoyed gossip. Ancient Romans were no exception. If anything, they were professionals. Imagine a city of 1 million people with no television, no internet, and no smartphones. People entertained themselves by talking. Constantly. Rumors spread through Rome faster than wildfire through dry grass. And when the subject was an emperor, the stories became even more dramatic. Especially after that emperor died. Because dead rulers cannot defend themselves. Their enemies, however, can write books. This creates a problem for modern historians. Suppose a senator hated Caligula. Suppose that senator survived his reign. Suppose he later shared stories with younger writers. How objective do you think those stories would be? Probably not very. Imagine asking someone's former political rival to write their biography. You might receive a fascinating book. You would not necessarily receive a balanced one. This does not mean Caligula was innocent. Far from it. But it does mean we should examine the evidence carefully. One popular theory suggests that Caligula suffered some kind of serious illness during his reign. As we discussed earlier, ancient sources mention a severe sickness shortly after he became emperor. Some historians wonder whether this illness affected his brain. Perhaps an infection. Perhaps a neurological condition. Perhaps something else entirely. The problem is that ancient descriptions are frustratingly vague. Roman doctors were not exactly modern specialists. Medical records from the period often resemble educated guesses. A physician might describe symptoms in great detail while completely misunderstanding their cause. Another might blame supernatural forces. A third might simply shrug and recommend different food. It was not an exact science. As a result, modern scholars can only speculate. No diagnosis is possible. No certainty exists. Yet the illness remains intriguing because many ancient writers claimed Caligula's personality changed afterward. Whether that observation reflects reality or political bias remains debated. Another possibility is that absolute power itself transformed him. This explanation may sound less dramatic than disease, but it is often more convincing. Think about Caligula's life. As a child, he watched family members destroyed by political intrigue. He learned to hide his emotions. He learned to distrust people. He learned that survival depended upon caution. Then, suddenly, he inherited the Roman Empire. Unlimited wealth. Unlimited authority. Unlimited attention. Every wish could become reality. Every command could become law. Most human beings are not designed for that kind of power. History provides countless examples. Kings, dictators, emperors, presidents, conquerors. Again and again, power changes people. Sometimes gradually, sometimes dramatically, sometimes disastrously. The emperor lived in a world where almost nobody could say no. And when nobody says no, reality becomes distorted. Imagine spending years surrounded by people who agree with everything you say. Every idea becomes brilliant. Every joke becomes hilarious. Every decision becomes wise. Eventually, distinguishing truth from flattery becomes nearly impossible. The result is not necessarily madness. It may simply be isolation. A dangerous form of isolation. One that affects judgment. One that encourages arrogance. One that slowly disconnects powerful individuals from ordinary life. Caligula appears to have suffered from exactly this problem. The further his reign progressed, the more detached he became from traditional restraints. The more detached he became, the stranger his behavior appeared. The stranger his behavior appeared, the more people feared him. And fear encouraged even more flattery. The cycle fed itself. Round and round. Until nobody knew how to stop it. Not even the emperor. Some modern historians argue that Caligula was less insane than theatrical. This is another fascinating possibility. Perhaps many of his bizarre actions were deliberate performances. Displays designed to shock observers. Displays designed to demonstrate power. Displays designed to humiliate opponents. After all, shock can be politically useful. People remember shocking rulers. People fear unpredictable rulers. And Caligula understood both facts extremely well. Take the famous horse story. Suppose he never seriously intended to appoint Incitatus as a senator. Suppose the entire thing was a joke. A cruel joke aimed at the Senate. That interpretation actually makes the story more political, not less. The insult becomes intentional. The message becomes clear. The emperor is not losing touch with reality. He is mocking Rome's aristocracy. Relentlessly. Publicly. And enjoying every moment of it. In some ways, that possibility is even more disturbing. Because it suggests calculation rather than confusion. Purpose rather than instability. Yet perhaps the truth lies somewhere between the extremes. Human beings are rarely simple. Historical figures are even less so. Caligula may have been arrogant, traumatized, isolated, suspicious, theatrical, cruel, intelligent, impulsive, and emotionally unstable all at the same time. People do not fit neatly into categories. Especially rulers. Especially rulers who spend years navigating dangerous political environments. The temptation to label him simply mad is understandable. Simple explanations are comforting. They make history easier to understand. But reality tends to be messy. And Caligula's reality was extraordinarily messy. One thing seems certain. His childhood left scars. How could it not? He watched relatives disappear. He witnessed political purges. He survived an environment where trust could become fatal. Those experiences shape people. They leave marks. Some visible. Others hidden. By the time Caligula became emperor, he had already spent most of his life surrounded by fear. Perhaps fear eventually became the only thing he truly understood. If so, it would explain much of his behavior. Because rulers often govern according to the lessons they learn early in life. And Caligula's lessons were harsh. Trust nobody. Show weakness to nobody. Control everything. Fear everyone. It is not difficult to imagine how such beliefs might influence an emperor. Especially a young emperor. Especially one with unlimited power. Yet despite all the debate, one fact remains undeniable. Caligula fascinated people. He fascinated ancient Romans. He fascinated medieval writers. He fascinated modern historians. 2,000 years later, he still fascinates audiences. There is something compelling about figures who stand at the edge of normal behavior. Figures who force us to ask uncomfortable questions about power and human nature. Caligula does exactly that. Was he a monster? A victim of circumstance? A tyrant? A tragic figure? A cautionary tale? Perhaps a little of each. History rarely offers clean answers. Instead, it offers mysteries. And Caligula remains one of its greatest mysteries. The emperor who entered Rome as a beloved prince. The ruler who became a symbol of excess. The man whose reputation grew so enormous that even his horse became immortal. And perhaps that is why his story endures. Not because we know exactly who he was, but because we do not. The uncertainty keeps the legend alive. The questions remain unanswered. The debate continues. And somewhere in the shadows of history, Caligula continues smiling that mysterious smile. A smile that has puzzled generations. A smile that seems to ask a question of its own. Was he truly mad? Or did he simply understand that history remembers the extraordinary far longer than the ordinary? The answer, like so much else about Caligula, may remain forever out of reach. The real life of Incitatus, Rome's most famous horse. For all the bloodshed, conspiracies, political intrigue, and imperial drama surrounding Caligula, it is remarkable that one of the most enduring figures in his story never spoke a single word. He never gave a speech. He never led an army. He never passed a law. He never participated in a conspiracy. In fact, he spent most of his life doing what horses generally prefer to do: eating, sleeping, running, and occasionally looking unimpressed by human behavior. Which, to be fair, is often a reasonable reaction. Yet somehow, out of all the countless citizens living within the Roman Empire, Incitatus became one of the most famous. Not because of anything he accomplished, but because of who owned him. History can be strange like that. Thousands of Roman scholars spent their lives studying philosophy and literature. Many are forgotten. One horse receives a marble stable and suddenly achieves immortality. There's probably a lesson hidden somewhere in that observation. Unfortunately, it may not be a very encouraging lesson. To understand Incitatus, we first need to understand horses in Roman society. Because horses occupied a special place in the ancient world. Today, most people encounter horses during vacations, sporting events, or perhaps while scrolling through videos online. For Romans, horses were part of everyday life. They carried messages. They transported goods. They served in the military. They pulled vehicles. They symbolized wealth and status. A magnificent horse could be worth a fortune. Elite Romans admired fine horses much the way wealthy people today admire luxury cars. The comparison is not perfect. Luxury cars generally require fewer carrots. But the principle remains similar. Possessing exceptional animals demonstrated prestige. It showed wealth. It showed power. And emperors possessed the greatest wealth and power of all. As a result, imperial stables often contained remarkable animals. The finest breeding. The finest trainers. The finest care available. Caligula's horses lived better than many Roman citizens. And Incitatus appears to have lived better than most horses. Ancient writers describe a life of astonishing comfort. The stories became legendary. According to various accounts, Incitatus occupied a stable constructed from marble. His feeding trough allegedly contained ivory decorations. Rich purple blankets covered him. Jewels adorned parts of his equipment. Servants attended his needs. Visitors treated him almost like a nobleman. Now, some of these descriptions may contain exaggeration. Ancient historians love dramatic details. A plain wooden stable does not make for exciting storytelling. A marble stable, however, captures attention immediately. Especially if your goal is demonstrating the emperor's excess. Nevertheless, there is little doubt that Incitatus received extraordinary treatment. The horse represented something important to Caligula. Perhaps affection. Perhaps status. Perhaps both. Imagine visiting the imperial estate and discovering that the emperor's favorite horse lived more comfortably than many senators. The message would be difficult to miss. And messages mattered in Roman politics. Everything communicated status. Clothing communicated status. Homes communicated status. Banquets communicated status. Even animals communicated status. The richer and more extravagant the display, the clearer the message. Caligula understood this perfectly. What remains unclear is whether Incitatus understood any of it. The horse probably viewed his luxurious surroundings somewhat differently. Excellent food appears regularly. People brush my coat. The stable is comfortable. This arrangement seems acceptable. Animals possess a remarkable ability to simplify complicated situations. Human beings often struggle with this skill. One story claims that before important races, guards enforced silence around the stable so Incitatus would not be disturbed. Think about that for a moment. Ancient Rome was one of the busiest cities in the world. Merchants shouted in crowded markets. Construction echoed through streets. Wagons rattled over stone roads. Crowds gathered everywhere. Yet according to the story, officials supposedly ordered quiet so one horse could enjoy uninterrupted rest. If true, it represents a wonderful example of imperial priorities. The empire could survive barbarian threats, political conspiracies, and financial crises. But disturbing the emperor's horse? Apparently that was unacceptable. Whether the story is completely accurate remains uncertain. But it reveals how Romans perceived Caligula. They believed he valued the horse enough for such measures. And perception often matters as much as reality. The stories spread because people found them believable. That tells us something important. By this stage of his reign, Romans expected extravagance from Caligula. They expected unusual behavior. They expected excess. A horse receiving royal treatment fit neatly into that image. It confirmed what many already believed. Meanwhile, Incitatus continued becoming a symbol. Not just of luxury. Not just of imperial eccentricity. But of something larger. The growing distance between emperor and ordinary reality. Because while Rome faced serious challenges, people heard stories about horse banquets. While officials struggled with administration, they heard stories about jeweled equipment. While senators worried about political survival, they heard stories about possible equine appointments to public office. The contrast was impossible to ignore. It almost felt like satire. The sort of exaggerated tale a playwright might invent. Yet here it was, attached to the ruler of the Roman world. Modern historians sometimes wonder whether Incitatus became famous precisely because he represented an easy way to criticize Caligula. Open criticism of emperors could be dangerous. Very dangerous. Criticizing a horse, however, was considerably safer. People could joke about Incitatus. They could laugh at the stories. They could express frustration indirectly. The horse became a symbol through which broader complaints could be voiced. In that sense, Incitatus occupied a curious position. He was simultaneously an animal and a political statement. Not intentionally, of course. The horse never requested this responsibility. History assigned it to him. Without permission. Without consultation. Without compensation. Which feels somewhat unfair. Yet historical fame is rarely democratic. The horse story also survived because it contains something timeless. People enjoy stories that expose the absurd side of power. Across centuries and cultures, audiences have always appreciated tales in which rulers behaved strangely. Such stories remind ordinary people that powerful individuals are still human. Flawed. Imperfect. Occasionally ridiculous. Incitatus became part of that tradition. a symbol of the absurdity that sometimes accompanies authority. Whether or not every detail was true became almost irrelevant. The story captured an emotional truth. It reflected widespread beliefs about Caligula. That alone ensured its survival. And survive it did. Empires vanished. Kingdoms rose and fell. Languages evolved. Civilizations transformed. Yet the horse remained. Generation after generation repeated the tale. The emperor who loved his horse. The emperor who supposedly wanted the horse to become a senator. The emperor whose favorite animal achieved greater fame than many Roman statesmen. It is difficult not to admire the sheer improbability of it all. Imagine explaining the situation to someone living at the time. 2,000 years from now, countless people will remember your horse. Not your financial reforms. Not your administrative policies. Not your military decisions. Your horse. Caligula would probably have found that amusing. Or infuriating. Possibly both. Because like many rulers, he likely expected history to remember his achievements. Instead, history remembered his oddities. This happens surprisingly often. Humans are storytellers. We remember vivid details. We remember strange anecdotes. We remember unusual moments. The horse proved more memorable than government paperwork. By a considerable margin. And so Incitatus continues galloping through history. Not as an athlete. Not as a military mount. Not as a champion racer. But as a legend. Perhaps the most famous horse in the ancient world. A creature whose life became entangled with questions of power, reputation, and memory. A creature who never asked for fame yet received it anyway. And perhaps, in the end, that is what makes the story so enduring. Because beneath all the politics and scandal lies something unexpectedly simple. A horse. A man. And a relationship that became larger than either of them. One transformed into a symbol of imperial excess. The other transformed into a symbol of imperial madness. Together they created one of history's strangest legends. A legend still being discussed nearly 20 centuries later. Not bad for a horse who probably spent most of his time thinking about food. In the next chapter, however, we leave the stable behind and step deeper into the world of the imperial palace itself. A place filled with luxury, fear, secrets, and endless political games. A place where appearances mattered more than truth. And where every smile might conceal a hidden danger. Because life inside Caligula's palace was far stranger than most Romans could ever imagine. Inside Caligula's palace, luxury, fear, and dangerous secrets. If you had approached the imperial palace in Rome during Caligula's reign, the first thing you would have noticed was not fear. It was beauty. That is often how power presents itself. Not as a threat. Not at first. Power prefers marble. Power prefers gold. Power prefers magnificent architecture that silently reminds visitors how small they are. And the imperial palace possessed plenty of opportunities for feeling small. The complex stretched across parts of the Palatine Hill, overlooking the city that ruled the Mediterranean world. From its terraces, one could gaze across temples, markets, public buildings, and crowded streets. Rome spread outward in every direction. A city of perhaps 1 million people. The beating heart of an empire. And above it all stood the emperor's residence. A physical reminder of who occupied the highest position in society. Visitors entering the palace encountered luxury at every turn. Polished marble reflected sunlight. Statues decorated hallways. Fountains splashed gently in courtyards. Paintings covered walls. Imported treasures arrived from every corner of the empire. Egyptian art. Greek sculptures. Exotic animals. Rare fabrics. Objects collected from lands many Romans would never see. The palace functioned as a museum of imperial wealth. A display case for power itself. Everything communicated the same message. The emperor possesses resources beyond imagination. And for many visitors, that message worked. The palace inspired awe. That was its purpose. Yet beneath the beauty lurked something less pleasant. Because while the palace appeared magnificent from the outside, life within its walls could be surprisingly dangerous. Especially during Caligula's reign. Imagine spending every day surrounded by politics. Not occasional politics. Not election year politics. Constant politics. Every conversation possessed hidden meanings. Every friendship carried risks. Every invitation might conceal a trap. The imperial court was a place where fortunes changed rapidly. Today's favorite could become tomorrow's enemy. Today's trusted advisor could become tomorrow's prisoner. No position remained secure forever. This uncertainty shaped the behavior of everyone inside the palace. Officials became cautious. Servants became observant. Guests became careful. People watched one another constantly. Not because they enjoyed doing so. Because survival often depended upon it. One careless comment. One misunderstood joke. One poorly timed criticism. Any of these might prove disastrous. Particularly when the emperor possessed a reputation for unpredictability. Caligula's court appears to have operated under precisely these conditions. Ancient sources repeatedly describe an atmosphere of tension. A feeling that danger might appear unexpectedly. Perhaps during a banquet. Perhaps during a meeting. Perhaps during a casual conversation. No one could be entirely certain. And uncertainty breeds anxiety. The emperor himself occupied the center of this world. Every decision flowed outward from him. Every career depended upon him. Every ambition revolved around him. This gave Caligula enormous influence. It also created enormous pressure. Modern people sometimes imagine rulers living carefree lives. Surrounded by luxury. Free from ordinary concerns. There is some truth to that image. But only some. Because ruling an empire involves burdens as well as privileges. Enemies multiply. Responsibilities accumulate. Trust becomes difficult. Paranoia becomes tempting. The higher a person rises, the harder it becomes to distinguish genuine loyalty from self-interest. Caligula faced exactly this problem. Almost everyone around him wanted something. Money. Status. Influence. Appointments. Favors. Political protection. The palace attracted ambition the way a flame attracts moths. Some ambitions remained harmless. Others did not. As a result, the emperor lived in a world filled with competing agendas. Every noble family pursued advantages. Every official sought advancement. Every faction maneuvered for influence. The palace resembled a giant chessboard. Except the pieces occasionally hated each other. And sometimes carried knives. Banquets played an important role in this environment. Roman elites loved banquets. They provided opportunities to socialize, negotiate, display wealth, and strengthen relationships. The imperial court hosted many such events. Guests reclined on couches. Food arrived in endless courses. Wine flowed freely. Musicians performed. Poets recited works. Conversation filled the halls. On the surface, everything appeared pleasant. Yet beneath the pleasantness, calculations continued. Who sat closest to the emperor? Who received the warmest greeting? Who attracted attention? Who seemed ignored? Small details mattered enormously. A favorable glance from the emperor could transform careers. A cold reception could destroy them. Participants learned to study every interaction. Every gesture became meaningful. Every expression became evidence. In such an environment, even dinner could feel exhausting. Especially if Caligula decided to amuse himself. Ancient writers describe occasions when the emperor delighted in unsettling guests. He enjoyed reminding them of his power. Sometimes through jokes. Sometimes through comments. Sometimes through actions that left people uncertain whether they should laugh or panic. One story claims that while dining with guests, Caligula suddenly burst into laughter. When asked what amused him, he allegedly replied that with a single command he could have everyone present executed. The room reportedly fell silent. And honestly, that seems like a reasonable reaction. Even if the story is exaggerated, it captures something important. The imbalance of power. Everyone knew the emperor possessed extraordinary authority. Caligula appears to have enjoyed reminding people of that fact. Frequently. Perhaps too frequently. This habit gradually eroded trust. People become uncomfortable when constantly reminded of their vulnerability. Particularly powerful people. Roman aristocrats were proud individuals. Many descended from families that had dominated politics for generations. They expected respect. They expected influence. Caligula often offered neither. Instead, he offered humiliation, which proved a poor strategy for building lasting loyalty. Meanwhile, rumors flowed endlessly through the palace. Rumors about appointments. Rumors about conspiracies. Rumors about relationships. Rumors about future plans. Some accurate. Others completely invented. The challenge was distinguishing between them. A difficult task in any era. Even more difficult in a court environment. Because information itself became a source of power. Knowing something before others knew it provided advantages. People traded information constantly. Whispers passed through corridors. Messages circulated quietly. Secrets acquired value. And everyone collected them. Including the emperor. Caligula appears to have enjoyed learning private information about others. Knowledge enhanced control. Control enhanced security. Or at least it seemed to. Yet information can become addictive. The more secrets one learns, the more secrets one suspects exist. The result is often suspicion. And suspicion already flourished within the palace. The emperor increasingly viewed potential threats everywhere. Whether those threats were real remains difficult to determine. Some certainly existed, as later events proved. Others may have existed only in imagination. Unfortunately, rulers rarely know the difference. They simply react. and repeated reactions create patterns. By the later years of Caligula's reign, fear had become one of the palace's defining characteristics. Not visible fear. Not open panic. Something subtler. A constant awareness that circumstances could change quickly. That safety depended upon favor. That favor could disappear. Imagine walking through beautiful halls while never feeling entirely secure. That was life for many courtiers. Luxury surrounded them. Yet anxiety accompanied it. The contrast feels almost poetic. Gold ceilings. Marble floors. Hidden fear. Ancient Rome excelled at contradictions. The palace embodied them perfectly. And perhaps nowhere were those contradictions more visible than in Caligula himself. A man capable of generosity and cruelty. Charm and intimidation. Confidence and insecurity. Spectacular public displays and private suspicion. His personality dominated the court. As his mood shifted, so did the atmosphere. One good day could lift spirits throughout the palace. One bad day could darken everything. Such influence is difficult for modern people to imagine. Yet it illustrates the reality of absolute power. When one individual controls so much, everyone else adapts accordingly. Even emotions become political. Even moods acquire consequences. As months passed, these tensions continued growing. The palace became more luxurious. The emperor became more isolated. The court became more nervous. And unseen enemies moved ever closer. The beautiful halls still glittered. The banquets still continued. The fountains still flowed. From the outside, everything appeared magnificent. But beneath the marble surface, cracks had begun spreading. Small at first. Almost invisible. Then larger. Then impossible to ignore. The empire's most powerful residence had become a place of hidden instability. And hidden instability rarely remains hidden forever. Eventually, something breaks. For Caligula, that breaking point was approaching rapidly. The conspirators were already gathering. The palace was already watching. The future was already moving toward its conclusion. And somewhere within those magnificent halls, surrounded by luxury beyond imagination, the emperor remained unaware that his time was running out. Or perhaps he suspected it. Perhaps everyone did. Because in ancient Rome, power often came with an unspoken truth. The higher you climbed, the further you could fall. And no one stood higher than the emperor. Which meant no one had further to fall. Not even Caligula. The women in Caligula's life, sisters, wives, scandals, and rumors. If there is one thing ancient historians loved almost as much as political scandals, it was romantic scandals. And if there is one thing they loved even more than romantic scandals, it was attaching those scandals to emperors. The combination was irresistible. Power. Wealth. Luxury. Forbidden relationships. Whispers behind palace walls. Everything required for a story that people would repeat for generations. As a result, many of the most sensational tales about Caligula involve the women in his life. His sisters. His wives. His lovers. The problem, as always, is separating truth from rumor. And in Caligula's case, the rumors are everywhere. Some may contain genuine facts. Others were almost certainly exaggerated. A few may have been completely invented. Yet together they reveal something fascinating about how Romans viewed the emperor. Because even when stories are false, they often reveal what people believed was possible. And many Romans believed almost anything about Caligula. To understand these stories, we must begin with his family. Family occupied an enormously important role in Roman society, especially among the elite. A powerful family provided protection, influence, and prestige. A famous family could shape a person's entire future. Caligula belonged to one of the most celebrated families in the empire. His father, Germanicus, remained beloved long after his death. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was famous for her determination and strength. His brothers and sisters carried some of the most recognizable names in Rome. In many ways, they resembled a royal family long before medieval kings and queens appeared. People watched them constantly. People discussed them constantly. People gossiped about them constantly. Some things never change. Among Caligula's siblings, 3 sisters became particularly important: Agrippina the Younger, Drusilla, and Livilla. These women spent their youth navigating the dangerous world of imperial politics. A world that offered privilege and danger in equal measure. Imagine growing up surrounded by luxury while simultaneously knowing that powerful enemies might destroy your family. That was their reality. And it shaped them profoundly. The sister who attracted the most attention during Caligula's reign was Drusilla. Ancient sources repeatedly emphasize the closeness of their relationship. In itself, this was not unusual. Roman aristocratic families often maintained strong family bonds. But ancient writers went further. Much further. Some accused Caligula of having an inappropriate relationship with Drusilla. The accusation became one of the most famous scandals associated with his reign. Modern historians approach these claims cautiously. Very cautiously. There is little solid evidence. Most accounts come from hostile sources writing after Caligula's death. Sources that frequently repeated sensational rumors. Could the stories be true? Possibly. Could they be false? Equally possible. The evidence simply does not allow certainty. What seems clear is that Caligula cared deeply about Drusilla. When she died unexpectedly in 38 CE, he was devastated. Ancient writers describe intense grief, public mourning, profound emotional distress. The emperor reportedly struggled to accept the loss. For someone who had already experienced so much family tragedy, Drusilla's death may have reopened old wounds. His father was gone. His mother was gone. Many relatives had vanished through exile, imprisonment, or death. Now another beloved family member was lost. The pattern must have felt cruelly familiar. Some historians wonder whether Drusilla's death contributed to changes in Caligula's behavior. Again, certainty is impossible. But grief affects people. Especially unresolved grief. Especially when combined with isolation and power. The emperor eventually ordered extraordinary honors for his sister. She received recognition rarely granted to women. Some accounts even suggest forms of divine commemoration. Such actions reinforced rumors. Critics interpreted them as evidence of unhealthy attachment. Supporters may have viewed them as expressions of sorrow. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. What is undeniable is that Drusilla's death affected him deeply. And deeply affected rulers do not always make wise decisions. Meanwhile, Caligula's relationships with his other sisters became increasingly complicated. At first, he publicly honored them. Their images appeared alongside his. They received privileges and visibility. For a time, the arrangement seemed favorable. Then politics intervened. Politics always intervenes. Eventually, accusations of conspiracy emerged. Whether those accusations reflected reality remains uncertain. What matters is that Caligula believed, or claimed to believe, that his sisters had become involved in plots against him. The consequences were severe. Exile followed. Relationships shattered. Trust disappeared. Once again, fear replaced affection. The pattern repeated itself. A pattern visible throughout much of Caligula's life. People began close. Then suspicion emerged. Then conflict followed. The cycle rarely ended well. The emperor's marriages proved equally turbulent. Roman emperors married for many reasons. Love occasionally played a role. Politics played a larger one. Marriage created alliances, strengthened positions, produced heirs, secured legitimacy. At least in theory. Reality often proved messy. Caligula married multiple times during his brief reign. Each relationship generated stories. Some romantic, some scandalous, many contradictory. One wife, Junia Claudia, died early in his life. Another marriage appears to have ended quickly. Ancient sources suggest a series of unstable relationships. Whether this reflects Caligula's personality, political circumstances, or simple bad luck remains difficult to determine. Probably some combination of all three. The most famous of his wives was Caesonia. Ancient historians describe her in dramatically different ways. Some portray her as intelligent and influential. Others portray her negatively. A few seem determined to blame her for nearly everything, which is often a warning sign when reading ancient history. Female figures frequently became convenient targets for criticism, particularly when writers disliked the men associated with them. What seems certain is that Caligula cared for Caesonia. They had a daughter together. For a brief period, the imperial family may have offered him something resembling stability, or at least the possibility of stability. Unfortunately, stability remained elusive. The political situation surrounding the emperor continued deteriorating. Enemies multiplied. Conspiracies expanded. Fear deepened. Personal relationships existed within that larger context. No marriage could fully escape it. No family could fully escape it. The palace was simply too dangerous. One of the most striking aspects of Caligula's story is how often personal and political life became inseparable. Friendships carried political implications. Marriages carried political implications. Family relationships carried political implications. Everything became political. Even affection. Even grief. Even loyalty. This made genuine human connection extraordinarily difficult. How do you trust someone when every relationship contains hidden calculations? How do you distinguish love from ambition? Friendship from self-interest? Support from opportunism? These questions haunted many rulers. They appear to have haunted Caligula as well. And perhaps that is why rumors flourished so easily. When people cannot see the truth, they invent explanations. The imperial palace provided endless opportunities for invention. Secrets encouraged speculation. Distance encouraged imagination. The result was a flood of stories. Some true, some false, many impossible to verify. Over time, those stories merged with legend. The historical Caligula became difficult to separate from the mythical Caligula. The emperor disappeared beneath layers of rumor. Even today, historians continue debating where reality ends and exaggeration begins. Yet perhaps the most revealing fact is not the content of the rumors themselves. It is their sheer quantity. People talked constantly about Caligula. Constantly. That level of attention rarely appears by accident. It reflects fascination, fear, curiosity. Sometimes all three at once. The women connected to him became part of that fascination. Their lives intertwined with his reputation. Their stories merged with his legend, whether they wished to or not. And like so many people surrounding the emperor, they found themselves trapped within forces larger than themselves. Politics, power, public scrutiny, historical memory, none of which are particularly gentle. As we move forward, another question begins emerging. If Caligula generated so many rumors during his lifetime, what happened after his death? Did the stories become more accurate? Or less? Did history remember the man? Or did it create a monster? The answer leads us into one of the most fascinating parts of this entire tale. Because the Caligula remembered today may not be exactly the same Caligula who walked the streets of Rome nearly 2,000 years ago. And understanding that difference changes everything. How history turned Caligula into a legend. By the time Caligula was dead, Rome had already begun doing what Rome always did after the death of an emperor. It started talking. And it never really stopped. At first, there was confusion. Then relief. Then anger. Then, almost immediately, storytelling. Because in ancient Rome, the end of a ruler's life was never just an ending. It was the beginning of a second life. A life built entirely from memory, rumor, and interpretation. And Caligula's second life would become far more famous than his first. Within weeks of his assassination, different versions of events began circulating. Some people described him as a tyrant finally removed by brave men. Others whispered about political revenge. Some focused on his cruelty. Others on his extravagance. And a few simply repeated the strangest stories they had heard, because those were the easiest to remember. This is how legends are born. Not in truth, but in repetition. The Roman world did not have newspapers in the modern sense. No verified news networks. No official fact-checking system. Information traveled through letters, public speeches, eyewitness accounts, and rumor. And rumor, as always, traveled fastest. Especially when the subject was an emperor who could no longer punish anyone for speaking freely. That alone changed everything. During his lifetime, speaking openly about Caligula was dangerous. After his death, it became almost fashionable. Writers suddenly felt free to describe him in increasingly dramatic ways. The emperor who once commanded absolute power could now be described without consequence. And consequence matters. It shapes tone. It shapes caution. It shapes truth. When consequence disappears, exaggeration often rushes in to fill the space. This is where our main sources for Caligula begin. writers like Suetonius and Cassius Dio became central to how later generations understood him. But they wrote decades, sometimes centuries, after his death. They were not eyewitnesses. They were historians compiling stories from earlier accounts, oral traditions, and political narratives. And importantly, they were writing in a world where Caligula had already become a symbol. Not just a man. A symbol of excess. A symbol of tyranny. A symbol of what happens when emperors go too far. This matters more than it seems. Because once a person becomes a symbol, details become less important than meaning. And meaning has a tendency to reshape details. Consider the famous horse story. By the time later writers recorded it, Incitatus was no longer just a horse. He was a metaphor. A punchline. A way to express the absurdity of imperial arrogance. Whether the story was fully accurate became secondary. What mattered was what it represented. The Senate reduced to humiliation. The emperor reduced to mockery. Power reduced to absurdity. It was too good a story not to survive. And so it survived. Even improved with retelling. This process happened repeatedly with Caligula. Small incidents became larger. Unusual actions became extreme. Political insults became madness. Ambiguity was gradually removed and replaced with certainty. Caligula was not just disliked. He was monstrous. Caligula was not just controversial. He was insane. Caligula was not just political. He was theatrical, exaggerated, almost mythological. Over time, the real person disappeared beneath layers of narrative. Part of this was political. Later emperors had an interest in portraying certain predecessors negatively. A bad emperor made a good comparison. A tyrant made a current ruler look better. History, in Rome, was not always neutral. It was sometimes useful. Another factor was cultural expectation. Romans had strong ideas about what bad rulers looked like. They expected cruelty. They expected extravagance. They expected signs of divine arrogance or moral collapse. So when they wrote about Caligula, they often shaped him to fit that expectation. Even unconsciously. If a ruler was disliked, stories tended to become more dramatic. If a ruler was feared, stories became darker. If a ruler was controversial, stories became extreme. Caligula checked all three boxes, which made him the perfect canvas for exaggeration. Modern historians face a difficult task because of this. They must separate possible reality from narrative construction. Not an easy job when the evidence has been filtered through centuries of storytelling. Some events attributed to Caligula may have some basis in truth. Others may be symbolic. Others may be misunderstandings. And some may simply be inventions that became too popular to disappear. Even the most famous accounts must be treated carefully. Take the claim that he declared himself a living god. Roman emperors often received divine honors after death. Some also accepted semi-divine status during life in certain contexts. So the idea is not entirely absurd. But the way it is often presented in later accounts may be exaggerated for effect. Similarly, many stories emphasize cruelty. But ancient political life itself was often brutal. Executions, exile, confiscation of property, these were not unique to Caligula. They were part of Roman governance. What made Caligula stand out was not necessarily the existence of such actions. but the way they were remembered and described. And memory is rarely objective. Another important factor is timing. Caligula ruled for less than 4 years. A very short reign. Yet the number of stories attached to him is enormous. This mismatch is significant. It suggests that storytelling, not documentation, played a major role in shaping his legacy. The shorter the reign, the easier it becomes for narratives to dominate. There is less stable record. More room for interpretation. More space for imagination. And imagination, in historical writing, is powerful. Especially when combined with fear. Because Caligula did something very important in Roman memory. He became a warning. A cautionary example. A ruler used to illustrate what happens when power becomes unrestrained. Once a historical figure becomes a warning, their biography stops being neutral. It becomes instructional. And instructional stories tend to simplify. They emphasize extremes. They remove nuance. They prioritize clarity over complexity. Caligula, in this sense, became less a person and more a lesson. A lesson about tyranny. A lesson about excess. A lesson about imperial danger. This is why the most famous stories about him are so dramatic. They are designed to be remembered. Not necessarily to be fully accurate. Over time, this process transformed Caligula into something almost mythical. A figure who sits at the boundary between history and legend. Part human. Part symbol. Part warning. And yet, beneath all the layers of interpretation, something real still exists. A young man from a powerful family. A child who grew up surrounded by political violence. A ruler who inherited absolute power at a young age. A man navigating a world of suspicion, ambition, and fear. That reality does not require madness to be complicated. It is already complicated on its own. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Do we need Caligula to be insane for his story to make sense? Or is it enough that he was human, placed in an environment where human behavior often becomes extreme? Ancient writers chose the first explanation. Modern historians often lean toward the second. But neither answer fully resolves the mystery. And perhaps that is why Caligula continues to fascinate us. Because he exists in that uncomfortable space between explanation and uncertainty. Between man and myth. Between history and story. And somewhere inside that space, the legend continues to grow. Shaped by centuries of retelling. Polished by imagination. And carried forward by the simple human desire to understand power by turning it into narrative. But before we conclude this journey, there is still one final question left. What remains of Caligula today? Not in stories. Not in rumors. But in history itself. That is where we will go next. To the final part of this story. The legacy of Caligula, what history really remembers. By the time we reach the end of Caligula's story, something strange has happened. The man is gone. The empire has moved on. New emperors have ruled. New crises have arrived. New legends have formed. And yet Caligula remains. Not as a living ruler. Not as a political force. But as an idea. A name that survives longer.